My dear students of class 10A and 10B, in my today's civics class, the lesson which I started teaching Prime Minister and Council of Ministers, I have chosen some points for your teaching. The points as I have chosen only for your conveniences, for your better understanding, the points are mentioned in the board. Please look at it. First point, differences between the Cabinet and the Council of Ministers. Differences between the Cabinet and the Council of Ministers. What are the differences between the Cabinet and the Council of Ministers? The first difference between the Council of Ministers and the Cabinet, I am writing larger group, smaller group. Larger group means Council of Ministers. Larger groups. And smaller group means smaller groups include Cabinet. Larger group, smaller groups. Larger groups, smaller group. Larger groups include Council of Ministers, smaller group includes Cabinet Ministers. That means Cabinet Minister, that means the Council of Ministers are ministers of different categories, namely Cabinet Ministers, Ministers of State, and Deputy Ministers. These are the three categories ministers are included in the Council of Ministers. That means Council of Ministers are having three categories of ministers: Cabinet Ministers, Ministers of State, and Deputy Ministers. These are the three ministers which are included in the Council of Ministers. On the contrary, Cabinet is a smaller group of ministry, where all senior most ministers, senior most members hold most important portfolios. Senior most members hold most important portfolios like defense, like finance, like railways, and like home, etc., etc. That means in the Cabinet, since it is a smaller group of ministry, there are ministers, there are senior most ministers hold important portfolios such as railways, home, defense, external affairs, etc., etc. And next point, Role of PM, Prime Minister, on the above ministers. Role. Which role does Prime Minister play on the above ministers? Now this is my discussion. Which role does the Prime Minister play on the above ministers? Which role does the Prime Minister play? The Prime Minister plays an important role on the above ministers, means on cabinet ministers and council of ministers. You know, the Prime Minister does not discuss any issue, any matters with other ministers, that means in deputy ministers or ministers of state, but with only the cabinet ministers. Before discussing this point, I would like to make one point clear to you, my dear students, for your better understanding. That is, Council of Ministers means, when I shall use the term Council of Ministers, in that case, we have to mention three ministers, three categories ministers of three categories: cabinet ministers, ministers of state, and deputy ministers. In that case, whenever we shall mention ministers of three categories, in that case, that ministers will be unitedly or collectively called Council of Ministers. So whenever we shall, suppose I uttered two ministers' names. I uttered categories of two ministers: ministers of state and deputy ministers, but I did not mention cabinet minister. In that case, I can't say that this is Council of Ministers. Suppose I mention cabinet ministers and deputy ministers, but I did not mention the name of ministers of state. In that case, it will be incomplete work. That means, in that case, these ministers will not be called, we can't call this minister as Council of Ministers. So, whenever we shall mention all the ministers, categories of ministers, namely cabinet ministers, minister of state, and deputy minister. In that case, we shall complete the full term of Council of Ministers, and that ministers will be called Council of Ministers. But if we omit any ministers, mention any two ministers but not three, in that case we shall commit mistake. That's why Council of Ministers means three categories ministers of three categories. We have to keep it in our mind. Now, what point we were discussing? Cabinet minister. Cabinet minister, Prime Minister cannot discuss any issue with other ministers in the Council of Ministers. Like the ministers of state and deputy ministers, these are the ministers. The Prime Minister cannot consult any issue, any matters, but with the cabinet ministers. Why? Because cabinet ministers are very reliable and faithful ministers of the Prime Minister, and Prime Minister himself chooses his reliable persons to be the cabinet ministers, on whom he can depend. That's why Prime Minister always gives important portfolios to the senior-most minister, important post to the senior-most members of Parliament, who are basically reliable, who are on whom the Prime Minister can rely, and These ministers are known as cabinet ministers, and since the most important portfolios are given to the senior most members of parliament who are chosen by the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister always consults with them regarding taking any decision, since the most important portfolios like defense, railways, home, external affairs, finance, these are the most important portfolios the senior most members of the parliament hold as a cabinet ministers. Prime Minister always, before taking any decision, always consults with them, but not consult other ministers like ministers of state and deputy ministers. Next point. Next point meeting. The Council of Ministers in their day-to-day working rarely meets together. The Council of Ministers in their day-to-day working or day-to-day working of the country, day-to-day working of governance, they meet rarely. On the contrary, the cabinet in their day-to-day working or day-to-day governance of the country, as frequently as possible, they meet. They always meet in the interest of taking decisions, because various types of important decisions are taken by the cabinet ministers. And in that case, the cabinet ministers call a number of meetings for consulting prime ministers and other dignitaries, means other responsible ministers. Suppose cabinet ministers called a meeting before taking any decision. In that case, all the ministers are supposed to be present there. Suppose ministers of external affairs, cabinet ministers like external affairs, minister of external affairs, ministers of defense, minister of finance, minister of railways, they all are cabinet ministers. So they all are supposed to be present in the meeting, and they all have to attend the meeting called by the cabinet ministers, called by the cabinet. And in that meeting, the role of the Prime Minister is very important, because the Prime Minister consults each and every point with the cabinet ministers. Suppose a railway minister is going to take any decision, the railway minister is going to increase the fare of railways, or the external affairs minister is going to take stern action against any state of India who has become a cause of tension, political tension. So what policy should be taken, the Prime Minister would like to know from the external ministers. And foreign minister, before taking any decision, any policy, before framing any policy, he communicates the message to the Prime Minister and consults thoroughly with the Prime Minister. And in consultation with both the Prime Minister and the respective ministers, the policies, before framing the policies, they come to a conclusion what policy should be taken, and then they frame the policy. That's why a number of meetings are conducted by the cabinet, where all cabinet ministers attend the meetings for consulting the Prime Minister. In that case, the role of Prime Minister is very important. But the Council of Ministers rarely meets, because the other two ministers, except cabinet, other two ministers, other two group of ministers, means ministers of state and deputy minister, they are actually dependent on the works of the cabinet. That means they are appointed in order to assist the works of the cabinet ministers. Both of the two ministers, ministers of state and cabinet ministers of state and deputy ministers are not independent ministers. They are dependent ministers. They are fully dependent on the cabinet ministers. That's why their role is inactive. They are to depend on, they always depend on the deputy cabinet ministers. And next point, next point our constitution has guaranteed one point I am discussing. Our Indian constitution has made an arrangement according to which the president acts on the advice of the prime minister. President acts on the advice of the council of ministers. According to the system of the constitution, our president, the president of our country, acts on the advice of the council of ministers. But actually, it is not correct, because the council of ministers are the group of ministers with three categories ministers of three categories, as I mentioned earlier: cabinet ministers, ministers of state, and deputy ministers. So it is not possible to the president to consult ministers of three categories, like once he will take advice from the cabinet ministers, then from ministers of state, then deputy minister. It is not possible. And since the name is council of ministers, that's why now the president, now the system is like that. The president acts on the advice of the cabinet ministers, not the council of ministers, because in the council of ministers, ministers of two categories, ministers of state and deputy ministers, are not independent ministers like cabinet ministers. They are dependent ministers. They are dependent on the decisions of the cabinet ministers and prime minister. That's why they are not independent ministers like the cabinet ministers. That's why the president acts on the advice of the cabinet ministers. The president acts on the advice of the cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers advise the president through whom? Cabinet ministers advise the president through the prime minister. That means prime minister initially consults the cabinet ministers, and then the prime minister advises the president in consultation with the cabinet ministers. And that's why it is said that the prime minister is the link between the cabinet and the president. Why? This type of question may come. We have to write very carefully. Why is the prime minister a link between the cabinet and the president? In that case, you have to write this answer very carefully. Now I am telling you the answer. The prime minister is known as a link between the cabinet and the president because of the following reasons. Number one, the prime minister consults the cabinet ministers and discuss the whole things with the president. Before consulting any issue with the cabinet, the prime minister formulates the policies and discusses the matter with the cabinet ministers. The Prime Minister as well as the cabinet ministers come to a conclusion, and at last the Prime Ministers, if any kind of mistake is committed by the Prime Minister, the cabinet minister, in consultation with the cabinet minister, the Prime Minister can make up his defect, and then in consultation with the cabinet minister, Prime Minister takes the decision. And what decision is taken by the Prime Minister? It is communicated to the President by the Prime Minister himself. But how? In consultation with that cabinet minister. Unless, second point, the Prime Minister before communicating any message to the office of the President, the Prime Minister sent one message that the decision of the cabinet would be revealed in consultation with them, and for that reason the office of the President is informed that what decision is going to be taken by the Prime Minister in consultation with the cabinet minister, so that the President must come to know that today is a day the Prime Minister is going to communicate a message to him for his office. And in that case, the President does not get himself involved in any other works. The President does not get himself involved in any other works, so that the message of the Prime Minister must reach his office reach his office in time, and he can learn what decision is taken by the Prime Minister in consultation with the cabinet minister. But you no need to write answer in the detailed form. Simply you will write one point, only one point you will mention. Why is the Prime Minister a link between the cabinet and the President? In that case, you will write only one answer. The Prime Minister is a link between the cabinet and the President because the decision is taken by the Prime Minister in consultation with the cabinet, and this message is communicated to the President by the Prime Minister himself on behalf of the cabinet ministers. That's why he is known as the link between the cabinet and the President. Up to this, only this point he will write. And next point, as I mentioned earlier, that this is so. Today time is over. Now, my dear students, next day the remaining part of this lesson will be continued. Thank you.